My parents mocked me as the dumb one, while my sister got a full ride to Harvard. On her graduation day, my father announced she would inherit everything, including a $16 million New York City mansion and a brand new Tesla. I was sitting in the back quietly until a stranger walked in, gave me a black envelope, and whispered that it was time to show them who I really was. Before I share the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and treated you like a second-class citizen in your own home. Growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta, my parents Richard and Eleanor were obsessed with image. They were the kind of people who served on every church committee and hosted lavish charity galas, ensuring everyone in our community knew exactly how much money they supposedly had. In their eyes, my younger sister Nia was the perfect daughter. With her lighter skin, her cheerleader smile, and her acceptance letter to Harvard Law, she was the ultimate trophy. They could parade around their elite friends. I was the dark-skinned, quiet daughter who chose to attend a state college and study finance. They called me the slow one. They told their friends I was doing little bookkeeping gigs to make ends meet, actively hiding the fact that I was building my own life. The undeniable peak of their favoritism was on full display last Saturday night at the Oakwood Country Club. My parents had rented out the entire grand ballroom to celebrate Nia graduating from Harvard Law. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over 50 round tables draped in imported white silk. The room was packed with their elite friends, local politicians, and the family of Nia and her fiancé, Sterling. Sterling was a tall, blonde, old money heir from Massachusetts whose family supposedly owned half of Boston. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They bent over backward to impress his parents, desperate to prove that our family was wealthy and sophisticated enough to merge with theirs. I sat at table number 9, tucked away near the kitchen doors, far from the center of attention. I wore a simple emerald gown blending into the background exactly as my mother had instructed. She had pulled me aside earlier that evening, telling me to keep a low profile so I would not embarrass them in front of Sterling and his mother. I simply nodded, taking a sip of my sparkling water. I was entirely unfazed by her cruelty because I was holding on to a secret that would soon shatter their entire reality. I did not just do bookkeeping. I was the founder and chief executive officer of an elite private equity firm that specialized in acquiring distressed corporate debt. And I had been very busy lately. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute brought my attention to the front of the room. My father, Richard, stood at the head table, his custom tuxedo catching the light. The room fell silent as he grabbed the microphone, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate perfection," my father announced, his booming voice echoing through the ballroom. "Nia, my beautiful girl, you have conquered the Ivy League. You have proven that this family breeds excellence. You are stepping into the world of high society, and your mother and I want to make sure you start your new life with Sterling on the absolute highest pedestal." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "First, to ensure you arrive at your new law firm in style, the keys to a brand new custom Tesla Model S." The crowd erupted in applause as Nia squealed, throwing her arms around Sterling and his neck. But my father held up his hand, signaling for quiet because he was not finished. "A car is just a car," he continued, his eyes darting specifically towards Sterling and his wealthy parents to ensure they were watching. "A true legacy requires a firm foundation, Nia Sterling. Your mother and I have purchased the deed to a $16 million historic mansion on the Upper East Side of New York City. It is completely yours, a wedding gift to start your empire." The ballroom gasped. People stood up to clap. My mother wiped a theatrical tear from her eye. Nia looked like she was about to faint from joy, kissing Sterling passionately. It was the ultimate display of wealth, a flex designed to secure my parents' status in the upper echelons of society. Then my father looked over the crowd until his eyes landed directly on me, sitting alone in the shadows near the kitchen. He could not resist the urge to elevate Nia by pushing me down. It was a sick habit he had cultivated for decades. "Of course not all of us can be Harvard material," my father said, chuckling into the microphone. We always knew Kiara was a bit slow content doing her little bookkeeping gigs in the background. Maybe Sterling can find her a nice data entry job at his family business. Laughter rippled through the room. Sterling leaned into the microphone. We might have an opening in the mailroom, Kiara. More laughter. I felt the pitying stares burning into my skin. I did not shed a single tear. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open. A man wearing a tailored black suit walked directly to my table. He placed a sealed black envelope in front of me. "The acquisition is confirmed, CEO," he whispered. "Now is the time to show them who you really are." I slowly opened the official debt transfer papers, looked up at my father, who was still grinning foolishly on the stage, and I smiled. The highly anticipated rehearsal dinner was held at an exclusive rooftop restaurant overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. It was a breathtaking venue my father definitely could not afford, but he booked it anyway to appease Sterling's family. Sterling's parents, Charles and Victoria, finally made an appearance. They arrived an hour late, dripping in generational arrogance and smelling of old money. Victoria spent the first 20 minutes complaining loudly about the humidity ruining her hair, while Charles sent back a $500 bottle of wine my father had specifically ordered, claiming it tasted like cheap table vinegar. My parents, instead of taking offense, practically bowed in submission. Eleanor hovered around Victoria, complimenting her vintage pearls, while Richard laughed much too hard at Charles and his dry, humorless jokes. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, silently observing this pathetic display of compliance. Nia sat beside Sterling, glowing in a custom silk dress, undoubtedly charged to one of Richard's maxed-out credit cards. She looked exactly like the perfect society wife in training, nodding along, as Victoria explained how their country club in Massachusetts was becoming far too diverse for her liking. My mother actually agreed with her, nodding enthusiastically, as if our own family was not part of that exact diversity she complained about. The self-hatred required to survive in this room was suffocating. Sterling sat comfortably back in his expensive chair, swirling his aged whiskey, soaking in the worship my family offered him. Every single time a passing waiter walked by, he snapped his fingers aggressively. At one particular point, he actually handed me his empty crystal glass, telling me to be useful and fetch him another strong drink. I did not move. I just looked at him, my expression completely blank, until an actual waiter rushed over to intervene. Richard shot me a lethal glare across the table, silently warning me not to ruin the evening. As dessert was served, Sterling stood up and tapped his silver fork against his crystal glass. The room quieted down immediately. He wrapped an arm around Nia, giving her a practiced, camera-ready kiss on the cheek. He thanked my parents for their generosity, though the word sounded like a sneer coming from his mouth. Then he raised his glass to Nia. He talked about how she was the exception to the rule, how she brought grace and intellect into his life, saving him from the mundane. But Sterling could never just give a compliment without stepping on someone else to do it. He looked directly at me. His gaze was full of that familiar privileged contempt. "And we really have to thank Kiara," he said, his loud voice carrying over the quiet dining room. "Without her around to remind us what uneducated struggle looks like, we might not appreciate Nia and her brilliance quite as much. Every great castle needs its help, right? Keep crunching those numbers in the background, Kiara. Maybe one day, if you work hard enough, you can do the taxes for my estate." Laughter erupted around the table. Charles and Victoria chuckled into their linen napkins. Nia giggled softly, leaning her head into Sterling's chest, as if he had said something incredibly charming. My own mother and father laughed along, sacrificing their darker-skinned daughter to secure their proximity to whiteness and perceived wealth. They expected me to shrink in my seat, run out of the room crying, or cause a loud scene validating their belief that I was unstable and ghetto. Instead, I reached into my clutch, pressing my thumb on my phone screen. I had started recording the moment Sterling stood up. I captured every racist, degrading word and the sickening sound of my family laughing at my public humiliation. I simply smiled, raising my glass of water in a silent toast back to him. Enjoy the castle, Sterling, I thought, because the moat is about to run completely dry. The dinner was supposed to transition into a night of dancing and expensive cocktails, but the atmosphere shifted abruptly when the private elevator doors chimed open. A strange man stepped out looking incredibly frantic and completely out of place among the expensive designer tuxedos and glamorous evening gowns. It was David, my father's most trusted senior accountant. He was sweating heavily through his button-down shirt, his face the color of wet ash. He bypassed the host stand entirely and marched directly toward our table, his eyes wide with terror. Richard stood up, his fake smile faltering as he saw the panic radiating from David. Richard quickly grabbed David by the arm and forcefully pulled him into the dark corridor near the restrooms, desperately trying to maintain his perfect public image, but they were still close enough that I could clearly see everything unfolding. I watched David pull a thick stack of legal papers from his leather briefcase. His hands were shaking so violently that a few pages dropped to the marble floor. Even over the soft jazz playing in the background, I could hear the sheer panic in David's voice. He told Richard that the bridge loan had defaulted. The massive toxic mezzanine loan Richard had taken out against his primary home and business to buy the $16 million mansion was officially dead. But that was not the worst part. David explained that the original bank had not just foreclosed, they had sold the debt earlier that afternoon. It was purchased by a ruthless private equity firm famous for liquidating assets overnight. They had triggered an acceleration clause. The entire balance was due immediately. He leaned against the wall, gasping for air, demanding to know the name of the firm that was about to strip him of his home, his business, and his legacy. My phone buzzed silently in my purse, signaling a successful transaction. The debt transfer was complete. They belonged to me now, and tomorrow morning they would lose everything. The annual family cookout was the undisputed highlight of my parents' social calendar. Huge white tents provided shade for rented mahogany tables, while hired servers circulated with expensive appetizers. My parents treated this gathering like a royal reception, and the absolute center of their universe was Nia and her new fiancé. I arrived on time, keeping my demeanor strictly neutral, and parked my car in my usual spot near the side driveway. Walking through the iron gates, the familiar toxic dynamic washed over me. Nia was holding court under the largest tent wearing pristine designer clothing. She laughed loudly, clinging to Sterling, who looked entirely smug. Sterling wore a pastel polo shirt and boat shoes, projecting the exact image of a wealthy heir summering in the Hamptons. My parents hovered around them like loyal servants, making sure Sterling had everything he needed, laughing at his terrible jokes, and introducing him as the brilliant future of our legacy. But invisibility was never an option when my family needed a target. Sterling spotted me from across the patio. Instead of coming over to say hello, he raised his hand and literally snapped his fingers in my direction. He pointed at his empty beer glass and then pointed at the cooler sitting nearby. "Hey, Kiara," he called out, his voice carrying over the music. "Grab me another imported lager from the bottom of that cooler. Make sure it is freezing cold." The sheer audacity of the gesture made a few nearby guests turn their heads in shock. He was treating me exactly like the hired catering staff. I stood completely still, my eyes locking onto his for a moment. I waited for my parents to intervene to remind Sterling that I was a professional woman and their daughter. Instead, my mother hurried over with a nervous, accommodating smile. "Oh, do not mind, Kiara," Eleanor said, gently pushing me aside to dig into the cooler herself. "She is used to being helpful." "Here you go, Sterling, darling," Richard chimed in, chuckling loudly. "Kiara is our little worker bee, always bustling around in the background." I watched my parents demean their own flesh and blood just to appease a white man who openly disrespected me. Sterling took the cold bottle from my mother without thanking her. He took a long drink, wiped his mouth, and looked me up and down with pure condescension. "You know, it really is fascinating," Sterling said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear perfectly. "Nia is so incredibly articulate, so poised and sophisticated. She belongs in high society. But you, Kiara, you have such a distinct urban vibe. It is almost like you two were raised in completely different worlds. The racist colorist microaggression hung in the humid summer air. He was blatantly implying that my darker skin and quiet confidence were somehow inferior to Nia and her lighter, acceptable aesthetic. I waited for my father, a proud black man, to defend his daughter. Instead, Richard and Eleanor burst into forced, uncomfortable laughter. "You are absolutely right, Sterling," my father agreed, shaking his head. "Nia got all the refinement. Kiara has always been a bit rough around the edges, but we love her anyway." Nia giggled, completely endorsing the humiliation of her own sister. I simply offered a cold, practiced smile. "I am exactly who I need to be, Sterling," I said softly, "and I am entirely comfortable with my world." My lack of reaction seemed to agitate him. He wanted me to lash out so he could play the victim. Before he could push the issue further, my mother clapped her hands together. "Kiara, we have a logistical problem," Eleanor announced. "Sterling parked his vehicle on the street, and we absolutely cannot have his beautiful Porsche sitting out there exposed to the general public. We need you to move your car off the concrete and park it on the back grass near the garbage bins. We need your prime driveway spot for Sterling." My father nodded in furious agreement. "Yes, move your car immediately, Kiara. Your car is fine on the dirt." They were demanding that I move my vehicle into the mud so the golden son-in-law could display his wealth. I could have refused. But a sudden brilliant thought crossed my mind. I needed to see that car up close. I needed to verify something about Sterling and his supposed generational wealth. "Of course," I said smoothly, pulling my keys from my pocket. "I would be happy to make room." "Give me the keys, Sterling. I will pull it into the driveway for you." Sterling hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic crossing his eyes before his arrogant facade returned. He tossed me the keys with a smirk. "Be careful with it. It is worth more than your entire life," he sneered. I walked away from the tent, leaving their toxic laughter behind me. I retrieved the Porsche from the street and slowly drove it onto the pristine concrete of my parents' driveway. As I shifted the car into park and turned off the engine, I leaned forward and casually glanced at the registration paperwork tucked into the corner of the windshield right above the dashboard. I squinted, reading the small print. The vehicle was not registered to Sterling. It was not registered to his wealthy family trust or any holding company associated with old money. The registration clearly stated the owner was a premium short-term luxury rental agency based out of a local airport. The lease agreement was for exactly 3 days. I sat back in the leather seat, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. Sterling was not a wealthy heir. He was a fraud. He was renting luxury cars by the day to maintain a flawless facade of infinite wealth, a facade my desperate status-obsessed parents had fallen for completely. They were practically bankrupting themselves to impress a man who was faking his entire lifestyle. I stepped out of the rented Porsche, locking the doors with a sharp beep. I walked toward the back grass where my own car was parked, pulling my secure, encrypted phone from my pocket. I opened my messaging app and selected the contact for my lead private investigator, a man who specialized in uncovering hidden corporate debt and financial fraud. I typed a single decisive message. "Look into Sterling and his family assets. I want bank records, property deeds, tax returns, and credit histories. Uncover everything. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want to know exactly how broke this man really is." I hit send, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and walked back toward the outdoor party. Let them have their cookout. Let them enjoy their rented luxury and their racist jokes. They had no idea they were dancing on the edge of a massive financial cliff, and I was the one holding the only parachute. 3 days after the cookout, the investigator I hired began sending over the preliminary findings. The data was slowly painting a picture of financial deception that was almost hard to believe. While I waited for the final comprehensive report on Sterling and his family, my own family continued their reckless descent into debt. The wedding planning had escalated into a frantic, status-obsessed circus. My mother and Nia were acting as if they were preparing for a royal coronation, desperate to prove to Sterling and his arrogant parents that our family belonged in their elite social circle. On a Tuesday morning, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a multi-million-dollar acquisition when my personal phone buzzed. It was an automated email from an exclusive bridal boutique in Manhattan. The subject line read, "Custom Bridal Gown Financial Guarantor Authorization." I clicked the link assuming it was a spam message or a mistake. It was neither. The attached invoice was for an $80,000 custom Vera Wang wedding dress. The primary client was listed as Nia. The financial guarantor, the person legally responsible for the entire balance if the bride failed to pay, was listed as me. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my mind processing the sheer unadulterated audacity of my sister. Nia had gone to one of the most expensive boutiques in the city, ordered a custom gown that cost more than what most people make in a year, and casually put my name down to foot the bill. She did not ask me, she did not consult me. She simply assumed that I, the family workhorse, would quietly absorb the cost, just to avoid another dramatic argument. Before I could even process the legal ramifications of her forging my contact information as a guarantor, my phone rang. It was my mother, Eleanor. She had perfectly timed the call, knowing the boutique was sending the authorization forms that morning. "Kiara," my mother said, her voice dripping with that manufactured syrupy sweetness she always used when she was about to demand money. "I assume you just received the email from the bridal boutique. Nia found the absolute perfect dress. It is a custom, Vera Wang. The silk alone is being imported from Italy." I leaned back in my leather executive chair. She put me down as the financial guarantor for an $80,000 dress, Mom. She did not even ask me. My mother sighed heavily into the receiver, immediately switching from sweet to defensive. "Do not start with your negative energy, Kiara. We are stretched incredibly thin right now, trying to secure the reception venue. Sterling and his parents expect a very specific caliber of luxury. Victoria has already invited several state senators to the ceremony. Nia cannot walk down the aisle looking like she bought her dress off a clearance rack. We have a reputation to maintain." "So your solution is to commit financial fraud by offering me up as the guarantor?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "It is not fraud," my mother snapped. "It is called stepping up for your family. We paid for your entire life growing up. We housed you, fed you, and put up with your difficult attitude. You owe us this. It is just $80,000. You have that little bookkeeping business of yours. Take out a personal loan if you have to. Empty your savings. Do whatever you need to do to make this happen. This is your chance to finally prove you are not completely useless to this family." I listened to her attempt to gaslight me into financing my sister and her delusion. A few years ago, I might have felt a sting of hurt. I might have tried to argue to demand respect, or to explain that I could not just pull $80,000 out of thin air to buy a dress. But standing where I was now, holding the keys to an empire they knew nothing about, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. "You want me to handle the financial authorization for the dress?" I asked quietly. "Yes," my mother said, sounding relieved that I was supposedly backing down so quickly. "Just sign the digital form and put your credit card down for the deposit. Do not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be, Kiara. Just do your part for once. I will make sure the boutique receives a fully authorized guarantor form today," I replied, and I ended the call before she could say another word. I did exactly what I promised. I handled the paperwork, but I certainly did not sign my own name, and I absolutely did not use my own titanium corporate card. My investigator had just sent over a file containing the banking details Sterling had provided to my father when they were discussing the fake dowry arrangements. Sterling had listed a specific routing number and account number, claiming it was his generational old money trust fund. He had bragged to my father that this account held millions of dollars completely restricted until the day he was legally married. I smiled, typing those exact banking details into the boutique and their payment portal. I officially transferred the guarantor liability and the $80,000 charge directly to Sterling and his supposed trust fund account. I authorized the transaction, legally binding his family to the exorbitant cost of Nia and her dream dress. I closed my laptop and went back to my actual work, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The fuse burned quietly for exactly 1 week. The boutique had a strict 7-day processing period for custom gown deposits. On the 8th day, right in the middle of a family group chat discussion about floral arrangements, Nia sent a frantic, hysterical message. The boutique had just called her in an absolute panic. The billing department tried to process the payment for the $80,000 dress, but the transaction was violently rejected by the banking system. The payment bounced because the old money trust fund account Sterling had provided did not even exist. My mother went into absolute overdrive to protect the illusion of perfection. When Nia called hyperventilating about the bounced $80,000 charge for her custom wedding gown, Eleanor did not pause to question Sterling. She did not demand to see proof of his supposed generational wealth. Instead, she immediately blamed a clerical error with the bridal boutique. She quietly took out another high-interest credit card in her own name to cover the massive deposit, sinking our family even deeper into a financial black hole. Sterling played the victim flawlessly. He claimed his trust fund manager required a formal written request 30 days in advance to authorize international wedding expenses. My parents swallowed the blatant lie whole. They were far too terrified of losing their proximity to whiteness and old money to demand actual banking proof. They simply dug their own grave a little deeper, desperately trying to keep the wedding on track. 3 days later was the annual Mount Zion Community Church Gala. This was not just a regular Sunday service. It was the most exclusive, highly anticipated social event for affluent African American families in Atlanta. Eleanor had been aggressively campaigning for the board president's seat for months. This year, she had invited Sterling and his parents, Charles and Victoria, to attend as our special guests. It was her ultimate power play, a calculated move to showcase our family standing to the entire congregation while simultaneously impressing her future in-laws. When I arrived at the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel where the gala was hosted, I quickly realized my place card had been deliberately moved. My parents, Nia Sterling, and his haughty parents were seated at the Platinum VIP table right at the front, directly next to the pastor. I was placed at table 32, an overflow table in the far back corner near the swinging kitchen doors. I was seated with restless teenagers and distant, estranged cousins. Eleanor had literally hidden me away. She did not want my dark skin, my quiet demeanor, and my lack of an Ivy League degree to ruin their pristine high society aesthetic in front of Victoria and Charles. I took my seat in the shadows and enjoyed my roasted chicken in complete peace. Halfway through the evening, Sterling wandered to the back of the room, supposedly looking for the restroom. He stopped by my table, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He looked down at my simple, tailored black dress, his eyes full of that familiar, privileged contempt. He told me it was a real shame I could not afford to dress up for such an important night. He joked that if I needed extra cash for a proper gown, his mother was currently looking for a new housekeeper at their summer estate. He chuckled at his own racist, degrading joke, fully expecting me to shrink away in shame. I just looked up at him, completely unbothered. I took a sip of my water and told him that true wealth does not need to announce itself with borrowed clothes and fake bank accounts. His smile vanished instantly. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes before he quickly turned around and hurried back to the safety of the VIP table. The absolute highlight of the gala was the fundraising auction. Mount Zion had been struggling under the weight of a massive $1.5 million mortgage for their newly constructed community youth center. Eleanor saw her perfect opportunity to secure the board presidency and impress Charles and Victoria at the exact same time. When the pastor asked for legacy donations, my father stood up, practically pushing his chair back to make a scene. He grabbed the microphone and proudly announced that our family was pledging $50,000 to the building fund. The crowd gasped and erupted into loud applause. Eleanor beamed, waving to the congregation like royalty. Charles and Victoria offered approving, polite nods. I sat in the back, shaking my head at the terrifying insanity of it all. They did not have $50,000. They were drowning in toxic debt, taking out predatory loans just to pay for a wedding dress. Yet they were publicly pledging money they did not possess just to buy a temporary illusion of social status. The applause eventually died down, and the pastor returned to the wooden podium. He held a thick, golden envelope in his trembling hands. His eyes were wide with pure disbelief as he looked out over the massive congregation. He asked for complete silence. He gripped the edges of the podium and announced that just moments before the gala began, the Church Finance Committee received a verified irreversible wire transfer. An anonymous donor had not just made a pledge, but had completely paid off the entire $1.5 million mortgage in a single lump sum. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. People were cheering loudly, crying and praising God. My parents looked visibly furious that their $50,000 fake pledge had been instantly overshadowed and forgotten. The pastor raised his hands high in the air, tears streaming freely down his face, asking the congregation to please settle down. He said the anonymous benefactor requested no public recognition, but the donor did leave a specific message attached to the wire transfer. He opened the golden note and read it aloud into the microphone. True power is not built by standing on the backs of others, but by quietly owning the ground they walk on. The room fell into a respectful, awestruck silence. But at the VIP table, Sterling suddenly froze. The color completely drained from his face. He slowly turned around in his chair, ignoring the cheering crowd around him. His eyes frantically scanned the massive ballroom until they locked directly onto me, sitting perfectly still in the shadows near the kitchen doors. That was not just a generic inspirational quote. It was the exact phrase I had written in my high school yearbook years ago, and it was a phrase I had repeated to him just weeks ago when he mocked my career choice at the family cookout. Sterling stared at me, his hands physically shaking as the terrifying realization finally began to dawn on him. The slow, uneducated sister, sitting at the overflow table, the woman he had just offered a job as a housekeeper, was the only person in the entire room who could casually drop $1.5 million in cash. I slipped out of the grand ballroom before the pastor could finish his closing prayer. The suffocating air of the gala had become entirely too much, and my work for the evening was done. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited in the cool night air, enjoying the absolute silence of the hotel parking lot. My phone buzzed in my clutch, signaling an incoming secure file from my private investigator, but before I could unlock the screen, heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete behind me. I turned around to find Sterling marching directly toward me. His face was flushed red, with a mixture of raw rage and unadulterated panic, his expensive pastel tie completely crooked and his breathing heavy. He looked frantically around the empty parking lot, ensuring there were no wealthy church members around to witness his mask slipping. The polished, arrogant heir who had been sneering at me all evening was entirely gone. In his place stood a desperate man who had just realized the ground beneath him was rapidly crumbling. "How did you do it, Kiara?" Sterling demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the empty parking lot. He closed the distance between us, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me. "Do not play dumb with me." That quote the pastor read tonight. That was your quote. Did you take out a fraudulent business loan to pay off that church? Are you trying to embarrass my family by acting like some big-shot donor? I looked up at him, my expression perfectly calm and entirely unbothered by his sudden outburst. I simply adjusted my coat and smiled. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Sterling. But if you are this upset over a charitable donation, perhaps your generational wealth is not as secure as you pretend it is." His jaw clenched so tightly, I thought his teeth might actually crack. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Listen to me, you arrogant little bookkeeper. I know you are running some kind of scam. People like you do not have that kind of money. My family has teams of elite corporate lawyers on retainer. I will have them audit your shady little business until you are buried in federal fines. I will ruin you." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of the cheap champagne he had been gulping all night to calm his nerves. "Unless," he whispered, his tone suddenly shifting from threatening to desperately manipulative. "Unless you want to prove you are actually part of this family. Nia needs another $50,000 to upgrade the floral arrangements for the reception. You are going to wire that money to my account by tomorrow morning. If you do, I will call off my lawyers. I will let you play your little rich girl game. I stared at him, genuinely marveling at his absolute audacity. He was trying to extort me to fund his wedding using imaginary lawyers to threaten a business he knew absolutely nothing about. I stepped forward, closing the space between us until he was forced to step back. "You do not have any lawyers, Sterling," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "You do not have an estate. You do not even own the suit you are wearing right now. So do not ever point your finger at me again, or I will make sure you spend the rest of your life paying off the dry cleaning bill." The valet pulled up with my car at that exact moment. I handed the attendant a crisp $100 bill, stepped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors, leaving Sterling standing alone on the concrete, his face pale with absolute terror. As soon as I was safely on the highway, I pulled over into a brightly lit commercial parking lot and opened the secure file my investigator had just sent. I connected my phone to my dashboard screen, completely ready to dissect the illusion of Sterling and his elite family. What I read was not just surprising, it was a masterpiece of white-collar fraud. Sterling did not come from old money, he came from dead money. According to the federal court documents glowing on my screen, his parents, Charles and Victoria, had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 5 years ago. Their ancestral estate in Massachusetts had been foreclosed on. Their country club memberships had been revoked for unpaid dues. Every luxury car they drove, every designer watch they wore, and every vacation they took was entirely funded by a complex web of maxed-out credit cards and high-interest personal loans. They were completely devastatingly broke. I scrolled further down the detailed report, searching for the motive. Why was this fake heir so determined to marry my sister? Nia was spoiled, but she certainly did not have her own money. Then I found the email transcripts between Sterling and my father. Richard had promised Sterling a massive multi-million-dollar cash dowry upon signing the marriage certificate, along with a 30% equity partnership in his firm. Sterling was not marrying Nia out of love. He was marrying her because my father was the perfect gullible host for a parasite who desperately needed a financial lifeline to save his own parents from absolute ruin. But that revelation created a massive, glaring contradiction. I knew my parents' finances better than anyone. Richard did not have millions of dollars in liquid cash to give away as a dowry. He certainly did not have $16 million in cash to buy the Upper East Side mansion he had just gifted them at the graduation gala. I opened my firm's proprietary database and ran a deep trace on my father's primary assets. I bypassed the standard, easily manipulated consumer credit checks and dug directly into the restricted commercial lending records that only institutional executives could access. My eyes scanned the complex legal jargon, isolating the exact financial mechanisms my father had used to construct his latest lie. Within seconds, the terrifying truth materialized on my screen. Richard had not bought the New York mansion with cash. He had taken out a mezzanine loan, a highly toxic, unregulated form of short-term financing favored by desperate real estate developers. The interest rate was predatory, compounding daily. But the most shocking part was the collateral. To secure the $16 million, Richard had cross-collateralized everything he owned. He had put up the deed to our family home in Atlanta and the total equity of his business. He had bet his entire life on this single loan. I sat back in my car, staring at the screen as the full, hilarious tragedy of the situation washed over me. Richard took out a toxic loan he could never afford because he firmly believed Sterling's wealthy family would pay it off after the wedding to secure the couple's lifestyle. Sterling was marrying Nia because he firmly believed Richard was wealthy enough to pay off his family's massive hidden debts. They were two broke, arrogant men running a financial scam on each other, entirely blinded by their own racist and classist assumptions. Neither of them had a single dime of actual liquid wealth. They were building a massive house of cards on a foundation of pure sand, entirely dependent on a financial rescue that was never going to come. But the absolute best part of this entire disastrous equation was the bank that issued Richard his toxic mezzanine loan. It was a distressed asset holding company, the exact same company my private equity firm had acquired just 3 hours ago. Richard thought he was borrowing money from a faceless corporate entity. He had no idea he was actually borrowing it from the daughter he had just publicly humiliated. The morning after the church gala brought a strange sense of clarity. I sat in my downtown office processing the irony of my father owing his existence to my firm. My phone interrupted the silence. It was a text from my mother Eleanor lacking her sweetness. She demanded I come to their family attorney immediately. She claimed it was an emergency requiring my signature. I knew exactly what kind of emergency they were facing. The bridge loan my father took out was entering default, and the weight of his financial lies was finally suffocating him. He was desperate for liquid cash, and he was about to try squeezing it out of the person he deemed disposable. I grabbed my coat, prepared for whatever scheme they constructed overnight. When I walked into the mahogany conference room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. My father, Richard, was pacing the floor, looking exhausted. His tailored suit looked rumpled, a contrast to his immaculate presentation. My mother sat stiffly in a leather chair, her lips pressed into an angry line. Nia was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression, acting as if my presence was an inconvenience. Sitting at the head of the wooden table was Arthur Vance, a lawyer my father kept on retainer for years. Arthur slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished table, tapping his pen against the paper. No one offered me a seat or a greeting. They looked at me like I was a piece of paperwork standing in the way of their plans. "Sit down and read this," my father commanded, pointing at the chair opposite the lawyer. "We are making some adjustments to the family estate." I took a seat, ignoring his hostile tone, and looked down at the documents. It was a relinquishment of assets. They had drafted a contract forcing me to surrender my 20% stake in my late grandmother and her estate. This was the only wealth left in our family, a trust fund my grandmother set aside for me before she passed away, because she knew how my parents operated. "Why am I looking at a document that strips me of my inheritance?" I asked, keeping my voice level. My mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with contempt. "Because your sister needs the liquidity, Kiara. Sterling and his parents expect a lifestyle, and this wedding is becoming expensive. We are restructuring the family assets to ensure Nia has the financial foundation she requires for high society. You do not even have a career or a husband. You have no use for this money." I looked at Nia, who looked up from her phone. She offered a smug little smile. "Do not make this difficult," Kiara Nia sneered. "You know I need the funds for the venue upgrades and the honeymoon. You can just go back to your life after this." I turned my attention back to my father. "You are asking me to sign away the only thing Grandma left me just so you can pay for a party?" I asked, letting a tremor slip into my voice. My father slammed his hands down on the conference table. "I am not asking you, Kiara. I am telling you. You have been an embarrassment to this family for years. You embarrass us at the country club, you embarrass us at church, and you are embarrassing us in front of Sterling. If you do not sign that paper right now, I will publicly disown you. I will go to the church board and every social organization in this city and tell them you stole from us. I will destroy whatever reputation you have left. You will be a pariah." The cruelty of his threat hung in the conference room. They were willing to destroy my life over money they wanted to waste on a billionaire. I knew I needed to give them the performance they expected. I let my shoulders slump forward, dropping my head in a display of defeat. I forced tears to well up in my eyes, letting one escape and roll down my cheek. I let out a broken sob, acting like a daughter who had just been shattered by her parents' rejection. "Please do not do this to me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I am trying to make you proud." My mother rolled her eyes in disgust. "Stop the crying and just sign the paper, Kiara. Be useful for once in your life." With trembling hands, I picked up the pen. I let out one breath before scribbling my signature across the bottom of the relinquishment documents. My father snatched the papers away instantly, a look of triumph washing over his face. He told me to get out of his sight. I stood up slowly, keeping my head bowed down toward the floor, and walked out of the quiet conference room like a completely broken woman. I rode the slow elevator down to the main lobby in silence, playing the helpless victim until the glass doors of the building closed behind me. The second my heels hit the concrete of the city sidewalk, my tears vanished instantly. The hunched posture disappeared, replaced by a spine made of steel. I pulled my phone from my bag and dialed the direct line to my attorney. The call connected on the very first ring. "They actually did it," I said, a smile spreading across my face. "They just committed documented fraud and extortion." My father and his lawyer had no idea that my grandmother and her estate was locked inside an irrevocable trust that could never be altered or transferred under any circumstances whatsoever. The document they forced me to sign was completely illegal. They truly thought they were stealing my inheritance to save themselves from ruin. "Add extortion to our lawsuit," I commanded, walking toward my waiting car. "It is finally time to burn their entire house down to the ground." The very next evening, my family hosted an obscenely lavish engagement party for Nia and Sterling at a private country club in Buckhead. They had rented the entire grand conservatory, filling the room with imported white orchids, crystal ice sculptures, and a live string quartet. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos floated gracefully through the crowded room, carrying polished silver trays of expensive caviar and vintage champagne. It was an absolute, undeniable masterclass in pure financial delusion. My desperate parents were bleeding out financially, yet they were throwing away another $50,000 just to maintain the illusion of infinite wealth. I arrived a few minutes late wearing a simple emerald silk dress, blending quietly into the busy background. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water and took a seat near the grand piano, watching the disastrous theater unfold. Nia was parading proudly around the room, eagerly showing off a massive diamond ring that I now knew was purchased on credit. Sterling stood by the open bar, laughing loudly, with a group of my father's business associates, playing the role of the humble billionaire heir to absolute perfection. But my eyes were fixed entirely on my father. Richard was standing near the terrace doors, and he looked completely unraveled. His posture was rigid, his skin looked pale and gray, and he was sweating profusely, despite the heavy air conditioning. Every 2 minutes, he nervously pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, stared at the screen with wide eyes, and frantically typed out a message. His creditors were calling. The massive mezzanine loan for the $16 million New York mansion had officially entered the grace period before total default, and my firm's automated collection algorithms were relentlessly lighting up his personal phone. I watched Richard scan the room, his eyes darting through the crowd in pure panic. He was frantically looking for Charles and Victoria Sterling's supposedly wealthy parents. They were supposedly the magical key to his entire reckless gamble. They were supposed to immediately transfer the millions they promised to pay off the mansion and permanently secure the newlywed couple's lifestyle. But Charles and Victoria were nowhere to be found. They had conveniently missed their flight from Boston, citing a sudden scheduling conflict with their phantom estate manager. Richard pulled Sterling aside, grabbing his arm a little too tightly. Even from completely across the room, I could read the desperate tension in my father's body language. Sterling smoothly brushed him off, offering a highly polished fake smile and gesturing vaguely to his phone, before walking away to get another drink. Sterling was stalling, and my father finally realized the life preserver he was banking on was a complete mirage. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard, commanding me to meet him in the private library down the hall. I took a slow sip of my water, checked my posture, and walked calmly toward the heavy oak doors. When I stepped inside the dimly lit library, my father was pacing aggressively in front of the fireplace. He looked like a cornered animal. He did not bother with a greeting. He immediately ordered me to lock the door and sit down. I remained standing, crossing my arms and waiting for the inevitable demand. He ran a shaking hand over his face and told me that the family was facing a temporary cash flow issue. He claimed a major corporate client had delayed a massive payment, and the bank was being unreasonably strict about a short-term bridge loan. Then came the absolute height of his audacity. He looked me straight in the eye and demanded that I take out a personal loan for $200,000. He told me to use my business credit, liquidate my savings, and put up my own apartment as collateral. He said he needed the cash wired to his account by tomorrow morning to cover the wedding vendors and secure the New York property until Sterling's family funds cleared next week. I stared at him, genuinely amazed by his narcissism. He had publicly humiliated me, kicked me out of the house at 18, and allowed a racist white man to treat me like a servant. Now facing total ruin, he expected me to bankrupt myself to save his superficial reputation. I stood my ground and kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly steady. I told him I did not have $200,000 lying around, and even if I did, I would never mortgage my own stability to pay for a wedding I was barely invited to. My father's face contorted with pure rage. He slammed his fist onto the leather desk. He accused me of being a selfish, bitter disappointment. He screamed that I was deliberately trying to ruin my sister and her happiness because I was jealous of her success. I simply shook my head. I told him that lack of planning on his part did not constitute a financial emergency on my part. I turned around and reached for the brass door handle. He lost his mind completely and utterly. He yelled that if I walked out that door, I was no longer his daughter. He told me I was dead to him. Then, in a final pathetic display of petty control, he pulled out his phone and spitefully canceled the family health insurance policy that still had my name attached to it. He sneered, telling me that I could pay for my own medical bills when I inevitably ended up sick and alone. He thought he was delivering a devastating blow, completely unaware that I had my own premium corporate health care for years. I walked silently out of the quiet library, leaving him entirely alone with his loudly ringing phone and his rapidly impending bankruptcy. He had just permanently severed the final remaining tie between us, which clearly meant I no longer had a single reason to hold back the absolute financial execution he so richly deserved. The rehearsal dinner took place the next evening on the top floor of an expensive French restaurant. Panoramic windows offered a sweeping view of the Atlanta skyline, a perfect backdrop for the mountain of financial lies my father was standing on. I arrived wearing a simple charcoal dress, entirely unfazed by our recent screaming match. Richard declared me dead to him, yet here I was, quietly taking my seat at the far end of the dining table. I was certainly not there as a beloved family member anymore. I was there to observe the final act of a slow-motion train wreck. Sterling and his parents, Charles and Victoria, arrived 45 minutes late, offering no apologies. They carried themselves with an insufferable arrogance, walking in as if they were doing us a massive favor simply by breathing the air. Victoria immediately began complaining about the city humidity. Charles flagged down a sommelier. He ordered 3 bottles of expensive vintage Bordeaux, charging them to my father. My desperate parents practically bowed to them. Eleanor fawned over Victoria, while Richard forced a strained smile, trying to play the wealthy host. I watched Richard closely. Beneath his tailored tuxedo, the man was falling apart. He kept checking his phone under the table, his hands trembling slightly every time the screen lit up. He was waiting for Charles to mention the massive dowry transfer that would magically save him from his impending default. But Charles only talked about golf courses, skillfully avoiding any conversation about actual cash. Sterling sat beside Nia, looking smug. He believed he had secured his financial lifeline and reveled in the royal treatment my parents were giving him. When the main course was cleared away, Sterling stood up from his chair. He grabbed his crystal wine glass and tapped it with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the entire room. The quiet chatter died down. Richard and Eleanor looked up with adoration, eagerly waiting to absorb whatever validation their white, supposedly billionaire future son-in-law was about to drop. Sterling cleared his throat, wrapping one arm around Naya, who gazed up at him like he was the center of the universe. "I just want to thank absolutely everyone for being here tonight." Sterling began, his loud voice projecting across the elegant room. He looked at my parents. "Richard, Eleanor, your generosity has been remarkable. You have raised an incredible woman. Nia is sophisticated, brilliant, and she has completely saved me from the mundane. She is going to make a spectacular addition to my family." Nia blushed, leaning her head against his chest. My parents beamed with absolute pride, ignoring the condescending undertone of his words. He was acting like he was rescuing her from obscurity. Then Sterling let his eyes wander down the length of the table until his gaze locked directly onto me. The smug, superior smile on his face widened. He could never just enjoy his moment. He always had to step on someone else to elevate himself. "And we certainly cannot forget about the rest of the family," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Kiara sitting quietly down there in the back. We really appreciate you showing up. Every great family needs a reminder of where they started. Someone has to crunch the numbers and do the heavy lifting in the background so the rest of us can shine. Do not worry, Kiara. Once Nia and I are settled in our new mansion, we might need a reliable bookkeeper to manage the household staff. I will be sure to toss the contract your way. It is always good to give back to the uneducated help. A loud chorus of cruel laughter erupted around the dining table. Charles and Victoria chuckled into their expensive napkins. Nia giggled softly, shaking her head. My own parents laughed along with them, prioritizing the comfort of a racist fraud over the dignity of their own daughter. I did not flinch, reaching into my clutch and quietly pressing the record button on my smartphone, capturing every degrading word, every chuckle, and every ounce of their blatant disrespect. I let the audio file save to my secure cloud server. That recording was going to be the perfect soundtrack for their upcoming eviction. Before Sterling could finish his arrogant toast, the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant swung open violently. A man burst into the room, gasping for air and looking wildly around the tables. It was David, my father, and his lead corporate accountant. He was sweating through his suit, completely ignoring the strict dress code and the confused stares of the wealthy guests. David spotted Richard and sprinted across the room, completely bypassing the host. He forcefully grabbed my father by the shoulder, his eyes wide with sheer unadulterated terror. Richard tried to brush him off his face, flushing red with embarrassment. "David, what on earth are you doing here?" Richard hissed through clenched teeth. "We are in the middle of a private dinner." David did not care. He leaned down, his voice trembling so badly that the people sitting nearby could easily hear him. "Sir, the loan," David stammered, pulling a crumpled legal document from his jacket. "The mezzanine loan for the New York property. It defaulted an hour ago. The bank did not just foreclose. They sold the debt. It was bought by a private equity firm that specializes in hostile liquidations. They are calling the entire balance due immediately, Richard. All of it. The house, the business, everything is collateral. We are ruined." Richard dropped his crystal wine glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, the red wine bleeding into the expensive rugs like a fresh wound. The color completely drained from his face as the crushing reality of his financial execution finally hit him. He was now completely bankrupt. I sat quietly at the end of the table, sipping my water, watching the absolute destruction of his empire with a calm, satisfied smile. The morning of the wedding arrived with a violent, chaotic energy that I found absolutely intoxicating. While my family spent the night panicking over the defaulted loan, they still clung to the desperate hope that it was just a banking error that could be magically fixed after the ceremony. They believed they could smile through the day, secure the marriage certificate, and force Sterling to bail them out before the markets opened on Monday. I sat in the corner of the massive bridal suite at the Ritz-Carlton, completely invisible. I sat in a plush armchair, sipping dark roast coffee and watching the final hours of their delusion play out in real time. The suite was a war zone of shredded tulle hairspray and raw panic. Eleanor was practically pulling her own hair out, screaming at a high-end florist who was firmly refusing to unload the massive, extravagant arrangements of imported white roses. The vendor was standing his ground at the double doors, holding a digital tablet and loudly explaining to anyone listening that the final payment of $20,000 had completely bounced. Eleanor's face was a dark, blotchy red, completely devoid of her usual polished grace. She frantically dug through her designer purse, pulling out credit card after credit card, furiously demanding the vendor try them all again. Every single swipe resulted in the same harsh, rejecting beep from the payment machine. Her pristine high society facade was violently cracking, revealing the desperate, financially ruined woman underneath. She yelled that they were good for the money, that they were a prominent family in the community, but the florist simply turned around, ignoring her pleas, and ordered his crew to pack the roses back into the delivery truck. Across the massive suite, Nia was having a spectacular, full-blown meltdown. She was sitting in a silk monogrammed robe in front of a lighted vanity mirror, sobbing hysterically, while two incredibly uncomfortable makeup artists stood awkwardly behind her, holding their brushes. Nia had tried to order a last-minute luxury breakfast spread for her bridesmaids from the hotel kitchen, only to have her own platinum cards humiliatingly declined. She threw her phone against the plush carpet, screaming that her bank was deliberately trying to ruin her perfect day. She demanded Eleanor fix it immediately, completely oblivious to the fact that her mother was currently losing a screaming match with the catering director over another entirely bounced payment in the hallway. The entire wedding infrastructure was violently collapsing around them because the credit lines keeping it alive had officially been frozen by the massive debt acceleration. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. It was a beautiful symphony of destruction, and I had orchestrated every single note. I did not say a word to offer comfort or solutions. I just watched them scramble like terrified rats on a rapidly sinking ship, desperately trying to plug massive holes with imaginary money they absolutely did not have. Then the heavy doors of the bridal suite swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud, and Sterling marched into the room. He was fully dressed in his custom-tailored tuxedo, but his face was twisted into an ugly, furious scowl. There was absolutely no trace of the loving, devoted groom. He marched directly past the frantic makeup artist and grabbed Nia by her arm, pulling her up from the vanity stool so forcefully that she stumbled backward. He did not ask how she was doing. He did not tell her she looked beautiful. He shoved his smartphone directly into her tear-stained face. "Where is the wire transfer?" Sterling demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the chaotic suite, silencing everyone. Richard promised the partnership equity and the cash dowry would be deposited into my offshore account by 8 o'clock this morning. It is now 10 o'clock, Nia. The account is completely empty. Where is the money? Nia looked terrified, shrinking away from the man she thought was her high society Prince Charming. She stammered, tears streaming down her face, telling him it was probably just a weekend processing delay, begging him to calm down and focus on the wedding. Sterling let out a harsh, cruel laugh that silenced the entire room. He dropped her arm in pure disgust. "Do not play stupid with me," Sterling snarled, finally showing his true gold-digging colors for everyone to clearly see. "I am not walking down that aisle and tying myself to you until that money clears. My parents are dealing with massive liquidity issues, and your father promised this cash injection would solve it. If your family is stalling, the wedding is off. I am not marrying into a broke family. You are completely useless to me without that dowry." Nia burst into fresh, agonizing tears, finally realizing that the man she worshipped only viewed her as a walking automated teller machine. Eleanor rushed over, desperately trying to calm Sterling down, pleading with him to trust them, promising the funds would be there on Monday. Sterling completely ignored her, swatting her hand away like she was a bothersome pest. He demanded to speak to Richard immediately. Right on cue, my father stumbled into the bridal suite. He looked exactly like a ghost. His eyes were completely vacant, his breathing was shallow, and his expensive tuxedo jacket was wrinkled. He was not looking at Nia, and he was not looking at the furious groom. He was staring blankly at a thick manila envelope in his violently shaking hands. A legal courier had just intercepted him in the hotel lobby minutes earlier. Richard did not say a single word to the screaming groom or his sobbing wife. He slowly pulled the stack of papers out. The front page was stamped in red ink. It was the formal notice of hostile asset seizure. The private equity firm was foreclosing on the $16 million mansion, his business, and his primary home. He was bankrupt. The silence in the bridal suite became absolute and suffocating. Richard stood frozen in the room, staring at the foreclosure notice in his shaking hands. The word bankrupt seemed to echo off the expensive silk wallpaper. Eleanor finally broke the quiet, her voice high and trembling with panic. She grabbed my father by his shoulders, shaking him, demanding to know what the legal papers meant. Richard could not look his wife in the eye. He collapsed onto the edge of a velvet sofa, burying his face in his hands. He confessed everything. He admitted there was no cash to buy the $16 million mansion. He explained how he took out a toxic mezzanine loan using our family home and his business as collateral. He looked up at Sterling with desperate eyes. He cried that he only took the massive risk because Sterling promised the trust fund would clear the debt the morning of the wedding. Sterling turned his gaze to his parents. He marched to Charles, screaming at them to call their financial manager immediately. He demanded they wire the promised funds to save the wedding. Charles looked at his son, his face pale. The aristocratic old money mask shattered. Charles looked down at the carpet and admitted the truth. There was no trust fund. There was absolutely nothing left. Charles confessed that their family had been bankrupt for 5 years. He admitted they were drowning in massive credit card debt and were actively dodging federal tax evasion charges. Victoria started sobbing, her makeup running. They revealed they were relying on the massive cash dowry Richard had promised. They needed my family money to save themselves from federal prison. The irony hung heavily in the room. Both families had been faking their wealth, desperately trying to scam each other out of money that neither of them actually possessed. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The polite high society facade vanished entirely, replaced by vicious, animalistic rage. Eleanor lunged forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at Victoria. My mother screamed at the top of her lungs, calling Victoria a pathetic scammer who used her fake prestige to con our family. Victoria shrieked right back, her face twisted in ugly fury. She called my mother a desperate social climber who was willing to sell her own daughter just to secure a seat at a country club she did not belong in. The two older women had to be physically separated by the frantic makeup artists who were desperately trying to flee the suite. Sterling watched his parents admit to total financial ruin. He realized he was not getting a single dime from my father. The loving, devoted groom persona vanished instantly. He turned toward Nia, who was sitting on the floor in her massive, expensive wedding dress, sobbing uncontrollably. Nia reached out, grabbing his tailored tuxedo jacket, begging him to stay, pleading that they could figure it out together because they loved each other. Sterling looked down at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. He violently ripped his jacket out of her grip, causing her to fall backward onto the plush carpet. He sneered, his voice dripping with venom. He called her a gullible fool. He told her she was completely useless to him without her father's bank account attached to her name. He reached up, roughly tearing the white rose boutonniere from his lapel and threw it directly at her tear-stained face. He announced that the wedding was officially canceled. He turned to his weeping parents and ordered them to pack their bags immediately. He yelled that they needed to escape the hotel before the front desk realized the credit cards keeping them in the luxury wing were about to violently bounce. Sterling and his parents stormed out of the bridal suite, slamming the heavy double doors behind them and leaving my family in a state of absolute ruin. Nia wailed loudly on the floor, tearing at the expensive silk of her useless wedding gown. Eleanor slumped against the vanity mirror, hyperventilating as the reality of losing her home, her social status, and her golden child future crashed down upon her. Richard remained on the velvet sofa, clutching the foreclosure notice like a lifeline. He was breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face. He frantically searched the legal document, his desperate eyes scanning the letterhead for any possible way out of this nightmare. He spotted the contact number for the chief executive officer of the private equity firm that now owned his entire life. With shaking fingers, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He announced to my crying mother that he was going to call the firm directly. He believed he could use his business charm to beg the executive for a temporary grace period, hoping to negotiate a way to save our family home from immediate seizure. Richard punched the numbers into his phone and pressed the green call button, raising the device to his ear. A heavy, terrified silence fell over the chaotic bridal suite as my parents waited for the mysterious corporate executive to answer the line. I remained seated in my plush armchair in the corner of the room, perfectly still, watching the entire pathetic display. Suddenly, a loud, crisp ringtone pierced the quiet air of the suite. The sound was coming directly from my designer purse resting on the small table beside me. My father stopped breathing. His eyes darted toward me. Eleanor stopped crying, staring at my bag in utter confusion. Nia looked up from the floor, wiping her ruined mascara. I calmly reached deep into my purse, wrapping my hand around my mobile device. I pulled the phone out and looked down at the brightly glowing screen. The caller identification clearly displayed my father and his private personal cell phone number. I looked up, making direct, unwavering eye contact with Richard. I offered him a cold, empty smile. Then I firmly pressed the red button and declined his call. I stood up from my plush armchair, smoothing the fabric of my dress and slinging my designer purse over my shoulder. I walked straight past my frozen father and my sobbing mother, without saying a single word. I left them suffocating in the deafening silence of that declined call. I did not owe them an explanation. The paperwork sitting in his trembling hands was explanation enough. I took the private elevator down to the hotel lobby, stepped into the bright morning sun, and went back to work. I had an empire to run and a very specific eviction to oversee. 3 days passed since the spectacular implosion of the wedding. Sterling and his fraudulent parents had vanished from Atlanta, entirely leaving behind a massive trail of unpaid hotel bills and bounced checks. My parents were completely ignoring the frantic calls from their bank, desperately trying to pretend their financial execution was just a temporary glitch. They buried their heads in the sand, clinging to the delusion that Richard could somehow negotiate his way out of a hostile asset seizure. But the most staggering display of pure, unadulterated delusion came from Nia. Despite her fiancé publicly dumping her and her father, facing absolute bankruptcy, she firmly believed she was still a high society princess. She firmly believed the $16 million mansion on the Upper East Side still belonged to her. She told everyone that Daddy was going to fix it. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Nia decided to double down on her fantasy. She hired a premium white glove moving company to transport her extensive collection of designer clothes and luxury furniture directly to the New York estate. She flew to the city, treating the entire disastrous weekend as a minor inconvenience. I monitored the entire situation from my corporate office in Manhattan, watching the security feeds my team had installed around the perimeter of the mansion. Nia stepped out of a highly expensive black car service wearing oversized sunglasses and a pristine white pantsuit, acting exactly like a billionaire heiress, arriving at her new castle. A massive moving truck parked illegally on the cobblestone street behind her, blocking traffic. Nia marched confidently up the grand marble steps of the estate, pulling a shiny silver key from her designer handbag. She slid the key into the ornate brass lock of the front door and turned it. The lock did not budge. She jiggled the handle, frowning in annoyance. She tried again, putting her shoulder into the heavy wooden door. It remained completely locked. My private security team had obviously changed the physical locks and installed a state-of-the-art biometric system the second the foreclosure paperwork cleared. Nia began throwing an absolute tantrum on the front porch. She stomped her expensive heels and screamed at the moving crew who were standing awkwardly on the sidewalk holding massive boxes of her luxury shoes. She demanded that they break the door down, claiming it was her property and the lock was simply jammed. The moving foreman, a burly man with zero patience for entitled behavior, flatly refused to destroy a mahogany door without seeing a valid deed. Nia pulled out her phone and frantically called her parents, crying about the incompetent staff ruining her moving day. Less than an hour later, Richard and Eleanor arrived in a frantic rush, having taken an early morning flight to New York to support their golden child. They marched up the sidewalk, ready to wage war against the moving company. Eleanor immediately started pointing her manicured finger at the foreman, screaming that he was disrespecting the owners of a $16 million property. Richard pulled out his phone loudly, threatening to call the police and have the movers arrested for breach of contract. They created a massive, humiliating spectacle right in the middle of one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country. Wealthy neighbors peeked out from behind their heavy velvet curtains, watching my family scream like absolute lunatics on the street corner. Richard yelled that he was a highly respected businessman and that his daughter had every legal right to move her belongings into the home he had purchased for her. He slammed his fist against the brass door handle, demanding entry. Eleanor wrapped her arms around a sobbing Nia, promising her that Daddy would fix the lock and she would be sleeping in her master suite by tonight. They were completely blinded by their own desperation, refusing to accept that the piece of paper delivered to the bridal suite was a legally binding eviction. I watched the pathetic display on my tablet for a few more minutes, savoring the absolute absurdity of their arrogance. Then I closed my screen, stood up from my executive desk, and signaled my head of security. It was time to give them a harsh reality check. I rode the private elevator down to the underground parking garage, where a convoy of vehicles was already waiting for me. I slid into the back of a pristine Maybach, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water while my driver smoothly navigated through the busy Manhattan traffic. Back at the mansion, the argument had reached a fever pitch. Richard was physically trying to force his way past the moving foreman, while Eleanor shouted empty threats about lawsuits and emotional distress. Nia was crying dramatically into her hands, playing the ultimate victim. The loud chaos abruptly stopped when two massive black sport utility vehicles pulled up to the curb, completely boxing in the moving truck. The heavy tires screeched against the asphalt. The doors of the vehicles swung open simultaneously. 6 heavily armed private security guards stepped out onto the sidewalk, forming a solid, impenetrable wall between my family and the marble steps of the estate. Richard froze, his angry shouting dying instantly in his throat. Eleanor stumbled backward, clutching Nia tightly as the entire street fell into a terrifying silence. Then the rear Maybach door slowly opened, revealing the true owner. I stepped out of the pristine Maybach. The heavy leather door clicked shut behind me. I was not wearing the simple emerald dress from the graduation party, or the quiet background clothes my mother always forced me to wear. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored crimson power suit that commanded the attention of the entire street. My heels clicked rhythmically against the cobblestone, cutting through the absolute terrifying silence that had just fallen over my family. I adjusted my sunglasses and looked at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They looked completely and utterly pathetic. Nia was the first one to break the silence. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped from the shoulders of our mother. Her tear-stained face contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure rage. She screamed at me, demanding to know what I was doing there. Her high-pitched voice echoed off the historic brick buildings surrounding us. She yelled that it was her house because Daddy bought the mansion for her. She cried that I had absolutely no right to be there, showing off and trying to ruin her moving day. My father stepped forward, his chest puffing out instinctively as he tried to regain control of the situation. He completely ignored the 6 heavily armed security guards standing like a fortress behind me. He demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted joke I was playing. His face flushed a deep, dangerous purple color. He asked if I had hired these thugs to harass my sister. He told me to command these men to step aside immediately so the movers could break the defective lock. He threatened to have me arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage if I did not get back into my rented car and drive away. Eleanor quickly joined the attack. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. She spat that I had always been a jealous, bitter disappointment while stepping slightly behind my father for protection. She yelled that my sister just had her wedding ruined by a horrible man, and instead of comforting her, I came here to mock her pain. She ordered me to get off the property before she called the police to report a crazy, unstable woman threatening the family. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single tear, an apology, or a defense. I looked at my father, a man drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, standing on the sidewalk of a house he lost 3 days ago, still desperately clinging to the illusion of his wealth. I looked at my mother, a woman who cared more about impressing a fake white billionaire than loving her own daughter. I looked at my sister, a spoiled, entitled adult, throwing a temper tantrum because her imaginary castle was locked tight. I simply smiled. I slowly removed my dark sunglasses, making direct, unwavering eye contact with my father. I did not say a single word. I walked forward. The intimidating security guards parted down the middle, creating a clear, protected path for me to walk through. My father instinctively stepped backward, stumbling over the uneven pavement as I passed him. Nia tried to lunge forward to block my path, but a security guard stepped in front of her, raising a massive hand to keep her firmly on the sidewalk. She screamed in frustration, stomping her expensive designer shoes against the concrete. I walked gracefully up the grand marble steps of the estate. The afternoon sun beat down on the heavy mahogany front door. The moving company foreman and his crew watched me in complete silence, recognizing the undeniable shift in authority. I stopped right in front of the massive brass door handle. I did not reach for a physical key. I simply lifted my right hand and placed my thumb against the sleek black biometric scanner my private security team had installed yesterday afternoon. A soft electronic beep echoed across the quiet porch. A green light flashed brightly on the scanner screen. The heavy internal deadbolts clicked loudly, sliding back in perfect unison. I pushed the massive wooden door open with a gentle push of my hand, revealing the sprawling, empty multi-million-dollar foyer inside. The reaction from the sidewalk was absolute paralyzing shock. My mother gasped, her hand flying up to cover her open mouth. Nia stopped crying, her eyes wide with a terrifying disbelief. She looked at the open door, then looked at me, unable to process how the sister she had mocked as a slow, uneducated bookkeeper had just unlocked the impenetrable fortress of her $16 million dream home. Richard looked like he was going to have a physical heart attack. His breathing became incredibly shallow. His eyes darted frantically from the biometric scanner to the expensive Maybach parked at the curb, then back to my perfectly tailored suit. The arrogant, wealthy patriarch persona completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, bankrupt man who finally realized he was entirely out of his depth. I turned around slowly, standing on the threshold of the open doorway. I looked down at my family from the top of the marble steps. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the massive, thick folder containing every single piece of their financial ruin. I walked back down the stairs, approaching the front of my pristine Maybach. I slammed the heavy folder down onto the hood of the car. The loud smack made my mother flinch violently. I looked at my father, who was staring at the red foreclosure stamps visible through the clear plastic folder cover. I leaned forward slowly, resting my bare hands on the warm metal of the car hood. I locked eyes with the man who had called me a slow, uneducated failure. "Welcome to my property," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent street. "Now get off of my front grass." The absolute silence that followed my words was heavy enough to physically crush them. Richard stared at the bright red foreclosure stamps, visible through the clear plastic cover of the folder resting on the hood of my Maybach. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Nia was the first to break the quiet, letting out a shrill, hysterical scream. She yelled that this was a sick, twisted prank, demanding that my security guards arrest me for stealing her house. I did not even look at her. I calmly opened the thick folder, pulling out the first stack of crisp white legal documents. I slid the primary ownership deed across the sleek, warm metal of the car hood, pushing it directly under my father and his trembling hands. I commanded Richard to read the signature line of the corporate entity that had purchased his highly toxic mezzanine loan. He leaned forward, his eyes darting across the complex legal jargon until they landed on the bottom of the final page. He gasped, stumbling backward, as if the paper had physically burned him. He read the printed name of the chief executive officer aloud. It was my name. The shock radiating from him was palpable. I looked at the man who had mocked my intelligence my entire life and methodically broke down exactly how I built a multi-million-dollar private equity firm specializing in distressed debt acquisition. I explained how they spent years assuming I was doing basic, low-level bookkeeping because they were too blinded by their own arrogance to ask what I actually did. I told him how my firm and its proprietary algorithms flagged his desperate high-interest loan the very moment it went into default, and I had personally authorized the aggressive buyout. Sterling tried to step forward, desperately attempting to salvage his crumbling alpha male persona. He pointed a shaking finger at me, claiming I could not possibly afford a transaction of this magnitude, and threatening to have his elite family lawyers sue me for corporate fraud. I did not raise my voice. I simply pulled out the second stack of papers from the folder. I slammed Sterling and his family bankruptcy filings from 5 years ago onto the hood of the car. I read aloud the devastating public records of his parents and their foreclosures, their revoked country club memberships, and their entirely maxed-out credit limits. I turned to look directly at Nia, who was visibly shaking in her designer white pantsuit. I told her that her billionaire Prince Charming was entirely fundamentally broke. I explained that Sterling was only marrying her to steal the massive cash dowry Richard had promised, hoping to save his own parents from federal tax evasion charges. Nia spun around to face Sterling, begging him to say it was a lie, pleading with him to defend their love. Sterling just backed away from her, his face pale with sheer terror, completely unable to utter a single word of defense. Richard suddenly erupted in fury, pointing his finger at Sterling and screaming that he had been conned. He yelled that Sterling had ruined the family. I cut my father off, instantly refusing to let him play the victim. I pulled out the original loan origination documents and held them up for the entire street to see. I exposed exactly how Richard had illegally cross-collateralized our family home in Atlanta and the total equity of his business just to buy this New York mansion. I told the group how he had bet our entire family legacy on a racist, classist illusion, fully believing a wealthy white family would magically pay off his debts. I told him he was a fraud just like Sterling, a desperate man who leveraged his own daughter just to buy a temporary seat at a table where he was never truly welcome. Eleanor tried to intervene, her voice shrill and panicked. She yelled that I was destroying the family reputation, claiming they were prominent members of the community who had just pledged $50,000 to the church building fund. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the historic brick buildings. I pulled out the final stack of papers exposing the secret, high-interest credit cards Eleanor had desperately opened in her own name just to cover the wedding floral deposits when Sterling and his fake trust fund bounced the wedding dress payment. I revealed that she was drowning in toxic debt, lying to her church friends, and actively participating in the financial suicide of our family just to maintain a fake upper-crust aesthetic. Every single lie, every hidden debt, every pathetic attempt to buy social status was now laid bare on the hood of my car for everyone to witness. The crushing reality completely crashed down on them. They were utterly stripped of every delusion they had built their lives upon. The wealthy facade vanished into the air. Eleanor suddenly dropped to her knees on the hard concrete sidewalk. The proud matriarch was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified woman. She began sobbing hysterically, reaching her shaking hands toward my tailored suit. She cried out, playing the ultimate victim card. She wailed that she was my mother, claiming she only pushed me because she knew I had greatness inside me. She begged me to remember we were family, pleading for mercy and asking me to give them their home back. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a single hand to help her up. I simply reached into my leather purse and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen, turned the volume up to maximum capacity, and firmly pressed play on the audio recording I had taken during the rehearsal dinner. The audio from my phone cut through the humid New York air. Sterling and his arrogant voice echoed from the small speaker, projecting every racist word he had spoken at the dinner. The recording captured him calling me the uneducated help and joking about hiring me to manage his staff. But the most devastating part was not Sterling. It was the unmistakable sound of my own family laughing with him. Eleanor knelt on the concrete, her fake tears drying up as her cruel laughter played directly in her face. The proof of their toxic betrayal hung heavily over the sidewalk, silencing any attempts to play victim. I pressed a button, cutting the audio and dropping the phone into my purse. I looked at my mother and told her that her performance was over. Before Eleanor could attempt another defense, a dented yellow taxi pulled up behind my Maybach. The door opened and Sterling stepped out onto the cobblestone. He looked frantic. His suit was rumpled and his hair was unkempt. He spent 3 days scrambling to save himself after his parents admitted to their tax evasion and bankruptcy. He likely came hoping to intercept the moving trucks and steal whatever assets Nia packed. Instead, he walked directly into a guarded foreclosure scene. Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from the armed guards to Richard and Eleanor. Then he looked at Nia, who was sitting on a box crying hysterically. Finally, his gaze traveled up the marble steps and locked onto me. He took in my crimson power suit, the biometric scanner, and the absolute authority I radiated. I could see the gears turning inside his calculating mind. In seconds, Sterling assessed the wreckage of the family he planned to scam. He realized Richard was financially destroyed and Nia was worthless to him, so he did what any parasitic fraud would do. He pivoted. Sterling completely ignored Nia as she called out his name. He walked right past his weeping former fiancée, stepping over a shoebox. He approached the marble steps, forcing his face into an unnatural smile. He held his hands up, looking at me with manufactured awe. Kiara, he said, his voice dripping with oily fake warmth. I have to admit, I am blown away. I heard the news about the corporate buyout. You are the chief executive officer of the private equity firm. That is incredibly impressive. I stood perfectly still, watching this arrogant man try to charm his way out of an execution. I did not say a word, allowing him to dig his own grave. He took another step forward, lowering his voice as if we were old friends. I always knew you were the smart one, Kiara, he said, chuckling softly. I saw how you observed everyone. I knew you were building something massive. I never actually wanted to marry Nia. She is shallow and completely gullible. I was just playing along with Richard and his social climbing games, but you and me, we operate on the same level. We understand how the real world works. He was throwing the woman he promised to marry under the bus, hoping I would respect his hustle. I walked down the marble steps until I stood on the same level as him. My security guards shifted their hands near their belts, but I raised a finger signaling them to hold. I looked Sterling up and down, taking in his sweating face. You think we operate on the same level, Sterling? I asked, keeping my voice quiet. You think because you rented luxury cars and faked a trust fund that you understand wealth. You are nothing but a con artist who preyed on the racial insecurities of a desperate family. You stood in my parents' backyard and snapped your fingers at me like I was a dog. You mocked my dark skin. You told me I had an urban vibe while praising my sister for being acceptable to your racist standards. You thought your proximity to whiteness gave you the right to treat me like dirt. Sterling swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering. He opened his mouth to offer an excuse, but I cut him off. Do not speak, I commanded. You offered me a job doing the taxes for your ancestral estate, but your family does not have an estate, do they? Charles and Victoria lost their home to foreclosure 5 years ago. They are dodging federal indictments for credit card fraud. They are drowning in distressed debt from secondary lenders. Sterling went completely pale. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he realized the depth of my knowledge. I took a step closer, dropping my voice to a whisper only he and my family could hear. And just like my father, you failed to pay attention to who actually buys distressed debt. I did not just buy the loan on this mansion. Last night my firm acquired the collection accounts associated with Charles and Victoria. I own your parents' debt. I own your family. Sterling stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. Nia let out a loud gasp, finally understanding the full scope of the deception. Richard buried his face in his hands, realizing he destroyed his legacy for a man who was owned by his daughter. I turned and walked over to an open box resting on the pavement. I reached inside and pulled out a wooden mop handle the crew left behind. I walked back to Sterling and shoved the handle into his chest, forcing him to grab it. Since you love treating me like the hired help, I thought it fair to return the favor, I said. My team needs someone to clean the steps before I move my furniture inside. I am offering you a job, Sterling. It pays minimum wage and you can use the money to start paying off the debt your parents owe me. Now start mopping the floors or get off my property. Sterling stared at the wooden mop handle in his trembling hands. The aristocratic facade he had weaponized against me for months completely dissolved into pure, humiliating cowardice. He looked at the heavy-duty bristles resting on the pristine marble steps of my mansion and then looked at the 6 armed security guards watching his every move. He dropped the mop. It hit the stone with a hollow clatter. He did not look at my father. He did not even glance at Nia, who was still sitting on a cardboard box, weeping on the sidewalk. Sterling simply turned around, sprinting toward his dented yellow taxi. He yanked the door open and ordered the driver to speed away, leaving his supposed bride and his grand illusions of wealth disappearing into the busy Manhattan traffic. Nia let out a pathetic wail as she watched the taxi turn the corner. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing into the sleeves of her expensive white blazer. But my father was not focused on the fleeing groom. Richard watched Sterling abandon them and then immediately turned his attention back to me. He straightened his wrinkled tuxedo jacket, puffing out his chest, and attempting to summon the booming, authoritative patriarch voice he had used to control our household for 3 decades. He marched up the first 2 steps, invading my personal space, trying to force me into submission through sheer parental intimidation. Kiara, this ridiculous tantrum ends right now, Richard commanded, his voice attempting to project absolute dominance. You have made your point. You proved you are a successful businesswoman and you embarrassed us. Now it is time to stop playing these vindictive games and act like a respectful daughter. I expect you to transfer the deeds and the debt portfolios back into my name by the end of the business day. We can restructure the commercial loans together, but you will restore my assets immediately. We have a family legacy to protect, and I will not allow you to tear it down because your feelings were hurt at a graduation party. Eleanor quickly stepped up behind him, nodding in frantic agreement. Your father is right, Kiara, she pleaded, her tone shifting into a sickeningly sweet manipulation that made my stomach turn. Family protects family. We are your blood. You cannot just steal your father and his life work. We raised you to be a team player. Transfer the properties back and we can finally be the united, powerful family we were always meant to be. We can forgive you for this public display if you just fix it right now. I stared at the two of them. I looked at the absolute delusion written across their desperate faces. They genuinely believed they still held power over me. They genuinely believed they could demand my obedience after spending my entire life treating me like a disposable peasant. I let out a laugh. It was not a bitter chuckle or a forced sound. It was a loud, genuine laugh that echoed off the towering brick walls of the Upper East Side. I laughed so hard my chest physically ached. Family legacy. I repeated, my voice sharp and clear, cutting through the humid afternoon air. What legacy exactly, Richard? The legacy where you kicked me out of the house at 18 because paying my state college tuition was a bad investment. The legacy where you sat in a country club and mocked my dark skin and my intelligence to impress a racist white man who just ran away from you in a yellow cab. You do not have a legacy. You have a mountain of toxic debt and a reputation built entirely on predatory loans and fake designer bags. You sold your own soul for an invitation to a table where they did not even want you to sit. I stopped laughing and my expression hardened into pure ice. I am not transferring a single asset back to you, I stated firmly. You gambled your entire life away and the house always wins. I am the house. I turned my head slightly and nodded to my head of security. He immediately stepped forward, opening a sleek black leather briefcase. He pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes sealed with bright red legal tape. He handed them directly to me. I looked down at the envelopes and then shoved them forcefully into my father and his chest, forcing his hands to catch them. Those are formal eviction notices, I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. The first envelope is for the primary suburban home in Atlanta. The second envelope is for your commercial business offices downtown. Since you used both properties as cross-collateral for the mezzanine loan you used to buy this mansion, my firm seized them yesterday afternoon. The local sheriff department has already served the physical copies to your staff. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises completely. If you or your belongings are still inside those buildings by Thursday morning, local law enforcement will physically remove you, and everything you own will be dragged out to the curb. Richard looked down at the red legal tape, his entire body shaking violently. The color completely drained from his face as the reality of his total homelessness crashed down upon him. Eleanor let out a loud, agonizing scream, grabbing her carefully styled hair and dropping back down onto the concrete. She wailed that I was a monster, an evil, ungrateful child destroying her own parents. That was the exact moment Nia completely snapped. The realization that she had no groom, no mansion, and now no childhood home to retreat to shattered her fragile, entitled mind. She sprang up from the cardboard box, her face twisted in pure, unhinged fury. She let out a wild, animalistic scream and lunged directly up the marble steps, aiming her hand squarely at my face. She intended to slap me, to physically punish me for destroying her perfect high society fantasy. I did not even blink. I did not move a single muscle. Before Nia could even bring her hand forward, my head of security stepped smoothly into her path. He moved with effortless precision, catching her wrist in his massive hand and stopping her strike entirely in mid-air. Nia shrieked, thrashing and kicking against the guard, trying desperately to break free. The security guard simply held her arm, firmly twisting it just enough to force her back down onto the bottom step. I walked slowly down the marble stairs until I was standing directly over my weeping, struggling sister. I looked down at her pristine white designer pantsuit and the expensive custom shoes she was wearing. "You really should be more careful with your wardrobe, Nia," I said coldly, keeping my eyes locked on her tear-stained face. "Do not wrinkle that suit. According to my financial analysts, Eleanor purchased your entire designer wedding wardrobe, including your Vera Wang dress, using an emergency high-interest credit card she opened last week. That credit account was bundled into the distressed debt portfolio my firm acquired this morning. Therefore, you do not own the clothes on your back. They legally belong to me. You are currently trespassing in my clothes on my property. Now take your boxes and get off my sidewalk before I have my team strip you down to your undergarments." Nia scrambled backward on the concrete, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning her heavy cardboard boxes, and sprinted down the cobblestone street in her expensive heels, leaving our parents standing completely alone on the sidewalk. Richard and Eleanor stared at the red eviction notices in their hands. The imposing wall of my private security guards took a synchronized step forward. My father grabbed my mother by the arm, and without another word, they turned and practically ran toward their rented vehicle. I watched their car speed away from the Upper East Side mansion, knowing their nightmare was only just beginning. Eleanor did not spend her final 48 hours packing her belongings into cardboard boxes. She spent it desperately clinging to the only currency she valued more than actual money. She tried to leverage her social status. As soon as she returned to Atlanta, she began frantically calling every single member of her elite country club and every influential woman on the Mount Zion church board. She spun a massive hysterical web of lies. She told them I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and hired corporate thugs to illegally seize my father and his perfectly healthy business. She claimed I was holding their assets hostage out of pure, unadulterated jealousy over my sister and her wedding. She tried to weaponize the community against me, hoping the collective social shame would force me to quietly surrender the deeds back to her control. She severely underestimated my absolute refusal to play by her toxic rules. I knew Eleanor would try to control the narrative, because controlling the narrative was her primary survival instinct. I did not wait for her toxic rumors to take root in the community. I opened my laptop and compiled a highly detailed, entirely factual digital dossier. I included the public bankruptcy filings of Sterling and his parents. I attached the original predatory mezzanine loan documents displaying Richard and his fraudulent cross-collateralization. I included the massive unpaid vendor invoices from the canceled wedding and the catastrophic credit card debts Eleanor had secretly accumulated. I laid out the exact humiliating truth. They were bankrupting their own family and committing federal financial crimes simply to appease a broke white family who treated them like absolute garbage. I did not send the extensive dossier to the local police or the city press. I sent it directly to the 5 biggest gossips in my mother and her elite social circle. I emailed the comprehensive file to the head of the country club membership committee, the president of the church auxiliary board, and 3 of Eleanor and her closest, most competitive friends. In the affluent, status-obsessed community, my parents worshipped scandalous information was the ultimate weapon. Within 2 hours, the digital dossier spread like wildfire through every group chat, every text thread, and every private phone call in the city. The perfectly curated, wealthy facade my parents had fiercely protected for 30 years was completely incinerated in a single afternoon. The social execution was swift and absolutely brutal. Eleanor and her smartphone suddenly went completely dead. The wealthy friends who had eagerly attended the engagement parties and praised my parents for their immense success stopped answering her desperate calls entirely. The country club board of directors sent a swift formal email to Richard, informing him that his membership was immediately suspended due to deeply concerning financial irregularities and thousands of dollars in unpaid monthly dues. The elite community did not just turn their backs on my parents. They actively bolted their doors and changed their locks. My family became the ultimate cautionary tale of fake wealth and pathetic social climbing overnight outcasts in the very circles they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. Despite facing a mandatory police eviction by Thursday morning, Eleanor and Richard refused to accept their total social annihilation. On Sunday morning, they decided to put on their absolute best designer clothes and drive to Mount Zion Community Church. They walked through the heavy wooden doors with their heads held high, desperately attempting to project grace under pressure. They fully expected their fellow church members to greet them, offer deep sympathy, and validate their fake victimhood. Instead, they were met with a terrifying icy silence. People physically turned their bodies away from them in the grand lobby. The ushers did not guide them to their usual velvet VIP seats near the main altar. My parents were forced to sit in the very back row, entirely isolated, surrounded by the quiet, judging whispers of the congregation. I was not physically in Atlanta, but my security team had arranged a live secure audio feed of the Sunday service so I could thoroughly monitor the final collapse of their reputation. The pastor stepped up to the grand wooden podium, his booming voice echoing through the massive sanctuary. He asked the congregation to settle down, announcing that he had a deeply important update regarding the miraculous payoff of the $1.5 million church mortgage. He stated that the anonymous donor had officially stepped forward to finalize the legal transfer of the property deed and secure the future of their youth center. My mother sat up straight in the back pew, her eyes wide, still holding on to the completely delusional hope that the pastor would magically announce Richard as the secret financial savior. The pastor smiled warmly, looking out over the absolutely silent crowd. He announced that the church was completely debt-free because of the incredible generosity, business brilliance, and unwavering grace of one of their very own. He spoke clearly into the microphone, publicly thanking Kiara, the chief executive officer of an elite private equity firm, for saving their spiritual home. The entire congregation erupted into a deafening, joyful standing ovation, loudly cheering my name, while Eleanor and Richard sat trapped in the back row, completely ostracized. Finally realizing that the daughter they had thrown away was now the most powerful and respected woman in their entire world. The Sunday service ended with my parents slipping out the back doors before anyone could speak to them. They had exactly 24 hours left before the local sheriffs arrived at their suburban estate and their downtown commercial offices to physically execute the eviction orders. Monday morning arrived with a heavy torrential downpour hitting the massive glass windows of my Manhattan executive suite. I was reviewing a secondary acquisition portfolio when my private intercom buzzed. My executive assistant informed me that Richard and Eleanor were standing in the main reception lobby. They did not have an appointment. They did not have legal representation. They had absolutely nothing left but pure, unfiltered desperation. I told my assistant to let them in and instructed my security personnel to remain quietly positioned in the hallway. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office slid open. My parents walked into the sprawling room. The transformation in their appearance was absolutely staggering. The arrogant posture, the designer accessories, and the haughty expressions were completely gone. Richard looked physically shrunken, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. Eleanor had dark, exhausted circles under her eyes, entirely stripped of her usual country club glamour. They stood awkwardly on the plush, imported carpet, staring at the massive mahogany desk that separated my world from theirs. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them a seat. I simply leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms and waiting for them to speak first. Richard swallowed hard, his pride completely breaking under the crushing weight of his imminent homelessness. "Kiara," he began, his voice cracking with a pathetic vulnerability I had never heard before. "Please, you have to stop the eviction process. The moving trucks are charging us triple rates because we have nowhere to put our belongings. My business accounts are entirely frozen. We cannot even afford a long-term hotel stay right now." Eleanor stepped forward, tears welling up in her tired eyes. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, literally begging for mercy. "We are so sorry, Kiara," she cried, her voice echoing in the quiet office. "We made terrible mistakes. We let the pressure of society blind us to what really mattered. But we are your parents. You cannot let us end up on the street. You have more money than you could ever spend. Just give us back the house in Atlanta. We will sign whatever payment plan you want. Please do not do this to your own blood. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire existence making me feel like a worthless burden. I kept my face perfectly neutral, completely devoid of the sympathy they were desperately trying to extract. You want to talk about blood? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. You want to invoke the title of parents now that your bank accounts are empty and your elite friends have blocked your numbers. Let us talk about how you treated your blood. I stood up from my chair, placing my hands flat on the smooth wood of my desk. You kicked me out of the house at 18 because you deemed my education a bad investment. You forced me to figure out survival on my own while you bought Nia luxury cars and Ivy League tuition. You sat at a graduation gala exactly 2 weeks ago and publicly mocked me as the slow, uneducated daughter just to get a cheap laugh out of a racist white family. Richard tried to look away, but I snapped my fingers, demanding his attention. Look at me, I commanded. You allowed Sterling to snap his fingers at me like a dog at your cookout. You laughed when he made colorous comments about my dark skin and my urban vibe. You actively participated in my degradation to protect your proximity to his fake generational wealth. You tried to force me to sign away my only inheritance just to pay for a wedding dress. You declared me dead to you the moment I refused to bankrupt myself for your mistakes. And now you stand in my corporate headquarters begging for the exact same grace you violently denied me my entire life. Eleanor let out a loud, agonizing sob, covering her face with her hands. She knew every single word I said was the absolute, undeniable truth. We were wrong, she wailed, dropping her gaze to the floor. We were so incredibly wrong. Being wrong is an honest mistake, I corrected her. What you did was systematic, calculated abuse. You used me as the scapegoat to elevate your golden child and your social status. You gambled your entire legacy on a lie, and you lost. I am not stopping the evictions. The sheriff will be at your properties tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. I am not returning the deed to your house, and I am not giving you a single dime of my capital to rebuild the business you destroyed through your own fraudulent greed. Richard gasped, realizing his final plea had failed. We have nowhere to go, he whispered, his voice breaking. Naya refuses to answer our calls because she blames us for losing her mansion. We are absolutely destitute. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a crisp manila folder. I tossed it across the desk. I am offering you exactly one deal, I announced. Inside that folder is a lease agreement for a small, modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. I have prepaid the rent for exactly 1 year. However, you must sign the attached non-disclosure agreements immediately. You will never contact me again. If you refuse, you can walk out of my building right now and take your chances surviving on the street. And you will never ever see my face or hear my voice again. I waited quietly, watching the heavy silence slowly suffocate the two completely broken people sitting right across from me. The heavy silence stretched across my executive office until it finally broke the last remaining shards of my father and his fragile pride. Richard stared at the manila folder sitting on my desk as if it were a loaded weapon. He looked over his shoulder at the frosted glass doors, fully aware of my security team standing guard in the hallway. There was no secret escape route. There were no wealthy friends left to call for a magical bailout. His hands shook violently as he reached across the mahogany wood and picked up the thick black pen resting next to the lease agreement. He did not say another word. He simply signed his name on the dotted line, officially surrendering his voice, his legacy, and his right to ever call me his daughter again. Eleanor wept silently as she took the pen from his trembling hand. She signed the non-disclosure agreement without even bothering to read the strict financial penalties attached to it. They were entirely defeated. I signaled my assistant to take the paperwork and securely escort them out of my building. The very next morning, the local sheriffs executed the formal eviction orders, exactly as I had promised. My parents were given exactly 1 hour to pack whatever meager personal belongings they could fit into garbage bags before they were escorted off the pristine suburban property. They were transported to the working-class neighborhood I had selected for them. It was a cramped, noisy two-bedroom apartment positioned directly over a bustling laundromat. The walls were thin, the appliances were ancient, and there was absolutely no country club within 50 miles. It was the exact type of neighborhood my mother had spent her entire life mocking and actively avoiding. When they unlocked the cheap hollow door to their new reality, Nia took one look at the peeling linoleum floor and absolutely lost her mind. The golden child dropped her two designer suitcases in the narrow hallway and flatly refused to step inside. She screamed at Eleanor, blaming her for the entire collapse of their empire. Nia yelled that she was a Harvard graduate who belonged in high society, and she would absolutely not degrade herself by living in a poor, filthy slum. She declared she was going to call an old boyfriend from a prominent political family, fully believing her beauty and her Ivy League degree would magically secure her a wealthy savior. She turned her back on her weeping parents, dragged her heavy suitcases down the concrete stairs, and marched out into the busy street to hail a taxi. Nia severely underestimated the absolute devastating power of the digital dossier I had leaked to the community. By the time she arrived at the upscale downtown hotel where her former wealthy friends regularly dined, she was already a walking social pariah. She approached a group of affluent women she used to party with, attempting to flash her signature charismatic smile. They did not smile back. They physically turned their backs on her, signaling the waitstaff to have her immediately removed from the private dining area. Her prominent political ex-boyfriend declined every single one of her frantic phone calls. The elite society she worshipped had read every page of her family and their fraudulent financial history. They knew she was completely broke, heavily associated with a massive scam, and entirely toxic to their own reputations. The golden child was left standing alone on the sidewalk, clutching her luggage, finally realizing that without my money secretly funding her lifestyle, she was absolutely nothing to the people she admired. While Nia was facing her brutal social reality, Sterling was facing the federal government. I am not a person who leaves loose ends. When my private equity firm acquired his parents and their massive debt portfolios, my legal team meticulously analyzed the fraudulent wire transfers Sterling had attempted to orchestrate during the fake dowry negotiations. He had actively engaged in interstate wire fraud, attempting to illegally secure funds across state lines under completely false pretenses. I did not just keep that information for my own amusement. I packaged the pristine, undeniable digital evidence and handed it directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Exactly 48 hours after he fled the canceled wedding in a yellow taxi, federal agents violently kicked down the door of the cheap motel where he and his parents were hiding. Sterling was dragged out into the parking lot in metal handcuffs, his arrogant old money facade completely destroyed by the flashing lights of multiple police cruisers. He was going to spend a very long time in a federal prison cell, wishing he had gladly accepted that wooden mop handle I offered him on my front steps. My biological family was entirely dismantled. They had lost their wealth, their status, their golden child, and their absolute freedom. They were trapped in a tiny apartment, forced to live out the rest of their days in the exact obscurity they had always feared, completely silenced by an ironclad legal contract. I had executed a flawless surgical extraction of their toxic influence from my life. But there was still one tiny, lingering thread connecting me to the people who had tried to destroy me. I was still carrying my father and his last name. It was a name built on predatory loans, racial self-hatred, and pathetic social climbing. It was a name I absolutely refused to carry into the massive empire I was currently building. I sat in the polished leather chair of a quiet downtown courtroom, completely alone, but entirely at peace. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, reviewed the thick stack of legal paperwork my attorneys had filed the previous week. He looked over his reading glasses and asked me if I fully understood the permanence of my request. I looked back at him with absolute unwavering certainty and told him I had never been more sure of anything in my entire life. He smiled, picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, decisive crack. With a single stroke of his pen, my toxic bloodline was officially legally severed. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of the courthouse, stepping into the bright, warm afternoon sun, leaving my past completely behind me. I was no longer the slow, uneducated daughter they had mocked in the shadows. I was a completely new woman, and I had an empty $16 million mansion waiting for me to fill it with my own legacy. 1,000 words. 6 months passed since I walked out of that downtown courthouse and officially severed the final legal tie to my toxic bloodline. The transition from being the mocked and dismissed daughter to the undisputed architect of my own empire was absolute. Tonight, the $16 million Upper East Side mansion did not belong to a spoiled golden child, and it was certainly not bought with fraudulent loans or desperate social climbing. It belonged entirely to me, and I had filled every single room with genuine power. I stood on the grand master balcony overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, listening to the sophisticated hum of the gala I was currently hosting. This was not a pathetic country club gathering filled with arrogant people faking their wealth. I had transformed the sprawling estate into the headquarters for my new philanthropic initiative, a massive networking event specifically designed to fund and elevate minority women in high finance. Below me, the main ballroom was packed with brilliant, dark-skinned women pitching startups, securing venture capital, and building authentic generational wealth. I leaned against the cool marble railing, wearing a custom emerald gown that finally reflected the exact woman I always knew I was. I took a slow, satisfying sip of vintage champagne, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me. My private security team stood quietly by the glass doors, ensuring my peace remained completely undisturbed. My sleek smartphone vibrated softly in my designer clutch. I pulled the device out and unlocked the glowing screen. It was a secure email from my lead private investigator providing the final quarterly update on the spectacular downfall of the people who had tried to destroy me. I opened the encrypted file and smiled as I read the headlines. Sterling was officially indicted by the federal government. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had thoroughly raided his cheap motel room following the massive digital trail of interstate wire fraud I had handed them. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, completely stripped of his pastel polo shirts and his arrogant white privilege, awaiting a lengthy criminal trial with absolutely no high-powered lawyers to save him. Charles and Victoria were right beside him, facing their own devastating federal tax evasion charges. The fake old money dynasty was completely incinerated, buried under decades of federal prison sentences. I scrolled down the document to find the latest update on Nia. The former golden child of the family had completely hit rock bottom. After burning through every single bridge in Atlanta and losing her imaginary New York castle, Nia was forced to face the brutal reality of actual work. My investigator attached a photograph. Nia was wearing a cheap polyester uniform, working the closing shift at a local retail clothing store in a struggling suburban mall. She was standing behind a cash register, ringing up discount sweaters with a miserable, exhausted expression on her face. There were no more custom Vera Wang dresses or luxury vacations. She was living paycheck to paycheck, entirely forgotten by the elite society she had worshipped. Her Harvard law degree was completely useless because no reputable law firm would ever hire a junior associate who was publicly tied to a massive, highly publicized real estate fraud scandal. She was trapped in the exact ordinary working-class life she had spent her entire existence mocking and trying to escape. The final section of the report detailed the miserable existence of Richard and Eleanor. They had actually stayed in the tiny, cramped apartment positioned directly above the noisy laundromat. They had absolutely no other choice. Stripped of their country club memberships, their massive suburban estate, and their entire social standing, my former parents had faded into total agonizing obscurity. Richard had tried to apply for mid-level management positions, but his destroyed credit and his ruined corporate reputation made him entirely unemployable. Eleanor was forced to shop at discount grocery stores, keeping her head bowed low to avoid making eye contact with anyone who might recognize her from her past life. They spent their days trapped in that tiny apartment, living in absolute silence, completely isolated from the wealthy world they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. They were serving a lifelong sentence of regret, completely bound by the strict non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from ever speaking my name again. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my clutch. The heavy burden of my painful past was now officially and completely eradicated. I looked back through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors at the brilliant women networking in my ballroom. They were sharing strategies, funding each other, and building real empires without compromising their dignity. That was my true lasting legacy. I had finally taken the profound pain my family inflicted upon me and weaponized it into pure, absolute, and unstoppable financial success. They had viciously called me the dumb one for so many years. They had laughed at my state college degree and mocked my bookkeeping business while actively drowning in their own financial incompetence. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of chess, unaware that I was the one who actually owned the entire board. I walked back toward the edge of the grand balcony, looking out over the magnificent city skyline. The city lights sparkled against the dark night sky. I was no longer the scapegoat or the disposable middle child. I had completely changed the game, rewriting every toxic rule they tried to force upon me. I raised my glass of champagne high into the cool night air, offering a silent, satisfying toast to the empty space where my family used to be. I had not just survived their abuse. I bought their debt, demolished their false reality, and built my own empire on top of their ruins. I took one final sip of my champagne, letting a triumphant smile spread across my face as the sounds of my new life echoed perfectly into the night. The most profound lesson is that true security originates from within yourself, rather than from external validation or toxic family expectations. Losing everything you once thought was essential can actually become the perfect foundation you need to rebuild a more authentic and fulfilling life. Navigating deep family betrayal teaches you that setting firm boundaries is absolutely necessary for your personal peace and growth. You must define success strictly on your own terms instead of seeking approval from people who constantly underestimate your true worth. Please share your own resilience story down below.